I want to just tell you exactly what's going on. The nation is ending a week marked by the second worst school shooting ever, but we continue to get these new details out of Texas which show mistakes, misinformation, and in some places, lies. It shows that the ongoing tragedy has become clearly a full-blown scandal, especially for Texas's Republican governor, Greg Abbott, who now says he's, quote, livid about how he received what was false information about aspects of this attack and response, and then how he spread it. A lot of this is unfolding and coming out over the course of today, so depending on what you've been up to, you may or may not have heard some of the gruesome details. But he's also using this as a time to take his platform within a crisis to lie about gun safety and gun control. So we'll get into that. Late today, the governor used a damage control press conference to repeatedly push false claims about public safety policy. Now, here are the new details that are emerging about the failed police response to this shooter, and some of them are just absolutely gut-wrenching. We are learning the timeline, which has now been updated because of the misinformation I mentioned. We're learning that 19 police officers erroneously waited 45 minutes outside the classroom without ever breaking in to confront the killer inside. We are learning that the killer was able to thus continue to repeatedly fire weapons again while the police were outside the door. These are facts that are terrible, but they are also significant. They are not the kind of facts that as a society we would benefit from ignoring. We are learning that more calls to 911 kept pouring in from inside the classroom, from the children inside who'd watched their fellow students murdered. And those new calls were begging for police who we now know were just a few feet away. And we know those police continue to wait and fail to act. Experts say this is a total breakdown failure and that it was a, quote, wrong decision. Days later, Texas officials do not even have words to try to explain this response failure. Pressed just today, the public safety chief just reiterated that officers on the scene made a decision to wait for more armed tactical officers to arrive rather than confront the armed shooter who was murdering children.
There was a 40-minute gap. And if the 911 operators were aware that children were alive in that classroom, why weren't officers notified of that? And if that's the case, why didn't they take action? That's the question. And again, I'll go back to the answer for right now, is that it was considered, okay, the decision was made on the scene. I wasn't there, but at the same point in time, you know, a decision was made that this was a barricaded subject situation. There was time to retrieve the keys and wait for a tactical team with the equipment to go ahead and breach the door and take on the subject at that point.
If you listen closely, you'll notice that was mostly a regurgitation of the problem as described, that they waited while children were killed, while there was enough time for children to actually use phones to continue to call 911, and then more children were killed. And then the individual there, you saw, that's the Texas Public Safety Department chief saying, well, he wasn't there. Other officials are more clearly stating what has become obvious, that this was the wrong call.
Obviously, you know, based upon the information we have, there were children in that classroom that were at risk. For the benefit of hindsight, where I'm sitting now, of course it was not the right decision. It was the wrong decision, period. There's no excuse for that.
Wrong decision, no excuse, and we've heard from other experts that go through why this violates what is current policy for confronting active shooters. I will get to that, but we always want to give you the facts as we have them. You can interpret them how you see fit. But here are the new details about the timeline. The shooter entering the school at 11:33, officers getting inside 30 minutes later, followed by those 911 calls I mentioned from inside the classroom, another 15 minutes until that tactical team finally arrived. Another call detailing that at least 8 kids were allegedly still alive inside. Please to send the police. 12:47 p.m. is when you get that call that's been noted here from the updated timeline. This is some of what Governor Abbott referred to that was not known or shared accurately earlier, although it was on 911 logs. Reading from the yellow there, 12:47, please, quote, send the police now. It was not until about 50 minutes of police waiting outside, though, that they entered and killed the shooter. This police inaction means that scenes like this, newly released photographs, were allowed to continue. These are the pictures from that day, people fleeing from a shooting that according to authorities, including what I just played for you, went on far longer than it had to. And we've also reported on people and parents who spent time outside the school, and this is so harrowing if you just think of them as people, human beings outside the school. Their kids are inside, and it's become clear that things aren't happening. It's become clear that the police are spending efforts outside the school restraining parents rather than going in, and that's why some began yelling and agitating for some action to maybe save their children's lives, because they could see that many police were not acting. That's what was going on outside. Now we have the timeline with more detail inside. And we have seen some authorities acknowledge or discuss a challenge here, which in American society, particularly around legal and law enforcement communities, is sometimes difficult to say. We don't have time for that here. I'm going to say it. We've seen authorities talk about the challenge of taking on active shooters who are armed for war and will be able to easily and swiftly kill any police who first come through the door. That's part of this reality. We covered the Buffalo massacre, which until this one was the largest mass shooting of the year. And I told you then, and I'll remind you tonight, what the Buffalo police said. They did say something accurate. They said they were outgunned by that single killer with weapons of war and body armor. And now we're seeing the evidence that some of these Texas officers were allegedly acting like they would do anything other than lean into a firefight this outgunned against these kind of legal weapons of war in America. Now, there's also evidence that some of these actions would violate their obligation and job duties and current policy. And we can get into that. That's a part of this. But others say this kind of response underscores why, wait for it, yes, let's talk about it, talking about policy and law and the danger to children. I'm not talking about politics. This is so much more important than politics. That's why a lot of people who study this and work on this full time in a lot of different countries say, if you don't want cops that scared of having to face off against someone armed like that, you have laws and rules where criminals can't get weapons of war that can outgun a whole group of officers. Now, when the police finally did act, their supervisors apparently later would mislead Texans and the public about some of the details of that initial response. So we are, again, doing what happens in this grim process in America, and we're doing the reporting and the work, and we're hearing, including from reporters on the ground who are taking the time to talk to people, we're hearing from some of the surviving children recounting the final horrifying minutes of the shooting.
I was telling my friend to not talk because he's going to hear us. The cop said, help if you need help, and then one of the persons in my class said help. The guy overheard, and he came in and shot her. And then the cops barged into that classroom, and the guy shot the cops, and the cops just started shooting.
That's some of the eyewitness account. Obviously, the child being maintained anonymous from a local interview. What's Texas's chief executive, the governor, doing about all this? I mean, the response here is engulfing his entire governorship. We have more on aspects of that later in the program, but let me tell you what he's doing. Governor Abbott took time today to make a political gesture during this period of essential crisis management for Texas. He recorded a brand new video to address and tout the NRA, National Rifle Association convention in Texas. It's all out in the open. The fear by police of criminals, because criminals can legally buy war weapons on the open market. It's all out in the open, the cowardice of politicians more concerned about losing an election than losing lives. It's all out in the open, their priorities. The galling, grim priority of taking time away from working on this crisis where Abbott says authorities misled him, His past briefings, he says, were inaccurate because of that. This crisis where funerals are still being planned right now for children, picking out the small coffins that you need when you have to bury kids after this kind of school shooting. He took time away from all that to make a political appeal today to the political gun lobby that fights so hard to make sure anyone, anywhere, can get their hands on a weapon of war in America, apparently capable of holding back over a dozen cops while children are slowly murdered. These are the literal facts as we end the week.